This is Craig and Andrew, two Ranger qualified Army officers with MBAs, here to help you improve your business through leadership.
Each week, we'll deliver easy lessons from the battlefield to the boardroom on how to improve team performance. If you're a leader or want to be, this is the place for you.
Welcome to the cohort.
Disclaimer: the views in this podcast are those of the authors alone and do not represent the views of the Department of Defense or the U.S. Army.
Hey, good afternoon, everybody. Today we're going to talk about conflict resolution. We'll talk about what buffaloes and cows have to do with conflict. Is there such thing as a healthy conflict? And then we'll get into some tactics for successful conflict resolution.
I'm excited. This is a good topic, Craig.
Yeah, I think conflict resolution is something, no matter where you're at in your leadership journey, it's going to affect you at some point.
Absolutely.
And I think it happens on a regular basis. I feel like in all my leadership positions, conflict at some degree comes up on a regular basis, even when everything's going good.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. You're never going to be conflict free your entire time as a leader. Otherwise, you're just keeping things the exact same as they were.
Right.
So things are going to come up and change, and that's going to cause friction, conflict that you have to successfully navigate and resolve.
Yeah. I like to use the idea or the example of buffaloes versus cows and how they deal with conflict. This was an example that was shared with me several years ago, that when bad weather is approaching, if you have a herd of cattle out in the field, the cattle will actually, as the storm moves their direction, they will try to get away from it. So they will move in the opposite direction, just trying to stay out of the bad weather.
Craig, sometimes I might be a cow. I'm not going to lie to you.
Yeah, and depending on the conflict or the storm there is, like that is an option that we sometimes choose. And then the opposite of that is the buffalo. And so the buffalo will actually, when they're out on the plains and the storms and the bad weather, when they sense that, they actually start moving towards the storm, which, sounds counterproductive until you realize that if the storm is blowing from west to east and you start moving from east to west, those buffalo actually reduce the amount of time they are in that storm. And
it's coming.
I find that
it's coming. You can avoid it like a cow.
Right.
You can go straight through it.
Yeah, and I think that's a interesting technique, there in the world of nature that we get to see. And if you look at a buffalo, I mean, it's really built, I feel like, to head into the storm. They're some pretty impressive creatures, but they don't run from the problems. But I think they are successful in that. They get through the storms faster. If you're the cattle and you're trying to just avoid the storm, you run the chance of walking with the storm for miles and get rained on the entire time. And then if you've paced yourself right, you may find the fence just in time to let it pass over you as slow as the storm moves. And you're just stuck there in the rain, no matter what you do about it.
That's a great point, man. I feel like there's a lot of ways we could further dissect that, right? But like step one as a buffalo is identification that the storm's coming.
Yeah.
Right? You can see the storm coming. Does a cow do the same thing? Or are they lacking the ability to identify the storm? I don't know. It might be a little bit too.
Yeah. That's an interesting point, though. Yeah. Like, can you identify the conflict or, the storm in this example? And the earlier you do that, I think there's advantage.
Yeah. Yeah. Because then you can make that choice, right? Do I continue to avoid and just get soaked longer? Or do I meet it head on and walk right through and hopefully reduce the amount of time that I'm in the conflict or the storm? I think that's a great example, man. I got to tell you, I'm a fan of that one. And I think my kids might get tired of me hearing it.
Yeah, it is. I like it because when we start talking about conflict, one of the first things I hear people describe for a leadership challenge is, well, they don't like to deal with conflict, or like, I just want to avoid that problem.
Right.
But I've yet to meet anyone who can successfully avoid conflict during their time in
Yeah.
leadership.
Yeah.
It's not a realistic objective. You're going to face conflict, and so it's better um, to deal with it. Because I always ask people is, so as you, even if you identify that storm approaching, if you ignore it and you try to avoid it and you
Hmm.
just let it build and fester, does that help your organization? Does that
Yeah.
help the situation that you're in? And most people will agree that no, if there is a conflict in your team and you try to avoid it and you try to not address it, it just gets worse.
Think about like you if you were leading a team of buffaloes, right, or cows, and they're going to follow you, and you've identified that problem,
Yeah,
are you going to allow your fellow cows to suffer in the storm longer, or are you
yeah,
going to say, "Hey, listen, it's going to suck for a minute, but then we're going to be through it on the other side, and
yeah,
it'll be better weather"? So, yeah, it's not. If you choose to avoid, you might be causing more problems later on for yourself and your team. So that's the further leadership part of it, right? Is you're doing this not just because it makes you feel better or worse or whatever, but because you have responsibility to those people that you lead.
yeah. And I can't think of any example where waiting to
Mm,
address the conflict has made anything better. Um, Typically, it makes it worse. The best case scenario is it stays the same,
yeah,
but I think that's rare. I think that most of the times when I think back at all the conflicts in different leadership positions I've been in, it is always better to address it as soon as you identify it. And, because I mean, conflict doesn't always get solved in one day or one meeting. Sometimes it's a process,
yeah,
and we want to go ahead and start movement on that. We don't want to delay it anymore because, like we've talked about, it is not advantageous to the team or the organization or the individuals. Because if we know that there's conflict between two individuals in our team, not only are they suffering the longer that conflict goes on, but the
yeah,
entire organization does.
yeah, yeah. It's going to bleed to the rest of the team, and it's going to affect productivity, right? Whatever your product is it's going to decrease that. So
Absolutely.
addressing it, yeah, I'm with you, man. I can't think of a time where waiting has helped the problem.
Yeah. And I think one of the most common sources that I see for conflict is miscommunication.
Mm,
We've
mm,
talked about communication, how vital that is. And I think that one of the ramifications when you don't get that right is you're going to have more conflict because of people not understanding what everybody else is doing, what their intent is, why they're behaving in that manner. And so that's something that I see show up a lot is that miscommunication causes these things.
yeah, yeah. I think you're right, man. Like the fundamental misunderstanding, right?
Yeah.
One person says one thing, they think they mean something else. I say, "Hey, Craig, I want you to go to the opposite of left, right." I might have said, "I want you to go to the opposite of left, comma, right." So go right is what I
Yeah.
meant, right? Correct. But you overheard left, right, left, like so that would then all of a
Yeah.
sudden, Craig, what are you doing? Why'd
Exactly.
you go that
Yeah.
way?
Yeah. There is, I think that there's so many times where we think that the message we sent was the message that was received,
Mm-hmm.
but unfortunately it's not. And so we think back to
Yeah,
that example of if I'm trying to be a good buffalo and I identify this potential storm, this potential conflict, not only do I need to address it, I need to get over there quick because one thing we learn with poor communication is it makes things worse, and it's going to progressively get worse and worse.
mm,
And so it may be something that we can avoid altogether, because the best way to resolve conflict, in my opinion, is to prevent it. Now, we've already established you're not going to prevent all of it,
Yeah.
but I would rather deal with conflict once a month than once a day. I mean, I
Or
think that
one time, right? Deal
right.
with that problem one time. And then if you clarify the communication and the standards and the desired outcomes, then through communication, right? Proper communication, then you don't have to solve that problem again with that person,
Yeah.
right? Because now they know, right? They know what you want to achieve, and they know what the standard is.
Hmm.
So now they can go out and execute. Now to don't have to second guess themselves because they understand and they've already kind of been through the conflict portion of it, right? Which is misunderstandings potentially created by miscommunication, right?
Yeah. The I'd like to pose the question, to everybody: is there such thing as a healthy conflict, and is
Mm.
conflict ever a good and natural part of leadership or of an organization? I guess would be a better way to phrase that. My personal thoughts is that I think there is healthy conflict, and I
Mm-hmm.
think that it does happen naturally.
Yeah, yeah, I agree totally, man.
The example I use sometimes is, I think of inside of a business, you have the sales team, and then you have your operations focused on maybe manufacturing. And manufacturing a lot of times is focused on how do we be as efficient as possible. We want the same things every day. We want to be able to replicate this. We want efficiencies. We don't want changes. We want to be able to refine the system that we've developed to be as efficient as possible. Sometimes the sales team is more focused on their customer. So they may have a
Mm-hmm.
customer who's asking for some customization to a product that is normally not customized. There is
Yeah,
a lot of times you can get some conflict that starts to arise there. And I say that it can be healthy because maybe it's that the sales team has identified a shift in the market demands. Maybe they've identified that all of your competitors are offering this. And so there may be a need for the business success and the organization's future to fulfill these requests that, the operations team may not have seen yet. But it's also important for that operations team to be able to communicate what the second and third order impacts are um, on their processes and their timelines and how that's going to play out.
yeah,
And I think that if you've got good communication in there, you can do that successfully, and you can have, and conflict's probably a strong word. It
yeah,
depends on the personalities, but I think there's should be at least be some friction or maybe tension a little bit, because you want both of those teams striving for success. And
yeah,
so if your
yeah,
operations team striving for success, they're going to be really focused on efficiency, and your sales team is probably going to be really focused on meeting the customer market demand, and that can put them on, I won't say opposite sides of the table, but they may not be sitting directly beside each other either.
yeah. No, so part of what you're getting to is like ultimately it makes things better because you're right. Planning team, operational team, they want to do things quickly, efficiently as possible, right? And same. So that way it's just easy,
Hmm.
right? But that may not always be the best, and as you said, may not always be what the customer wants. Sales, sure we can do anything, right? But they also need to learn that there's can be some constraints to promises made, right?
Yeah.
And over promising is not helpful. So
No.
like one time when I was in Afghanistan as the troop commander, we were planning this operation in a kind of a short timeline to do it. So it was going to be two platoons going out and doing it, and then my first sergeant, so like my right hand man, I was going to be kind of with them and with me and stuff. And so for lack of time, I brought those two platoon leaders in, and so each platoon is about 20 to 30 people, somewhere in there. Uh, so I brought the two platoon leaders in and my first sergeant, and we kind of planned together. And so it was interesting because everybody kind of came to with their own plan, right? Their
Hmm.
platoon leaders came with their own plans. First sergeant kind of has his own plan, and I had my own idea, really, not plan, of how this
Right.
was going to work. And so we all set our plans, right? The platoon leaders went first, and then the first sergeant pitched his idea of how to do it, and then I laid out my idea. And it was interesting because we each had different ideas of how to do it, right?
Hmm.
75% of it was probably the same. We'll move this way, down this route, maneuver down this route, plan fires here and here, and then have this platoon on QRF. They can go ahead and get staged this time and all that. And if we move this way or move around this way, this choke point, those different kind of things. Um, but there was a couple of things so from my perspective, right, as a troop commander, the one responsible overall for all, the ground force commander, I didn't like or I didn't think would get to achieve the best results for what we were after. It might have been the most efficient, right, from the first sergeant's
Right.
point of view. Um, it wasn't going to quite get what I wanted to achieve.
Hmm.
So, in order to maximize the effect from my point of view, I had to take all these suggestions, and finally, I had to be like, "Oh, okay. First one, I agree, but I disagree. So we're going to take some of that, but we're not going to do the other bits."
Yeah.
And so there's a little bit of tension there because he and I were best friends, and this is kind of a short time, critical
Right.
operation to arrest a high value target. And so emotions were really high,
Hmm.
right? And there was a lot riding on this, so it was kind of high pressure situation. So it was that trust between us and that conflict. There was that tension. Then we talked it out and said, "Hey, I like this, I like that, but I don't like that, so we're not going to do that."
Yeah.
And so that was the conflict. And he said, "Okay, well, let's move out then."
Yeah.
And so it made the plan better. All those little bits that they contributed made the plan better. And once I talked it through, right, I was able, because of the conflict, I was able to better articulate kind of how I saw it, what I wanted to do, include the other parts. Everybody understood it better. Everybody was on board, and we moved out.
Yeah.
So
And
it makes things better.
yeah. It sounds like too it helped in that situation where y'all were all sitting there together at the
Mm,
table. Everyone brought their ideas.
yeah.
Everyone was able to communicate that, and then you, as the leader in that scenario, ultimately it's up to you. It's your
Mm,
decision. You're the one responsible for that. But it allowed you. It sounds like that you were able to communicate with everybody. They were able to express their ideas, so you could take that in to enhance your plan. But also, when you made your ultimate decision, you were able to communicate why. Hey, this is the
yeah.
purpose behind this. This is why we're going to do this. And then I feel like that prevents those second and third order effects of conflict that we get sometimes when we don't all understand why that decision was made.
Yeah. Yeah. Because to pull on that, right? What if I hadn't done that?
Yeah.
Right. What if I said, "Oh, okay, First Sergeant, let's do what you said."
Yeah.
Then I would probably be passive aggressive for the rest of the
Right.
operation,
Yeah.
right? And there would still be tension,
Yeah.
and the platoon leaders might have disagreed with some of what he said, right? And they might not have understood some of the other things that are going on or why
Hmm.
we're doing it that way, right? So if I had avoided it,
Yeah.
it would not have turned out as well.
Yeah. And into your point there, especially when you've got leaders at different levels, I think it's always really important that, you know, sounds like you had leaders multiple levels there. There was some of that tension,
Mm,
that potential for conflict. Maybe you're at the beginning of you've got healthy conflict going on, but when y'all are able to communicate that, by the time you walk out of the room, everybody's on the same page. Everybody understands things, and
yeah.
then that way the entire organization benefits from that. I think on multiple levels, they benefit from having that healthy conflict because more ideas were shared and opinions were expressed. But at the end of the day, the leader made a decision
Mhm.
and everyone understood why that decision was made, and then everyone as a team can go out and be productive and make sure that that mission gets accomplished.
Yeah. So, so I'm going to take this and move off on a little tangent, if in case I haven't already. But I think everybody says emotional intelligence quite a bit, but like to put it into a tangible sense, right?
Yeah.
I was aware of the emotions of the situation, right? We
Hmm.
had like an hour to roll out of the gate, high
Mm.
value target, high pressure situation. I'd worked with these guys for a long time, but there was still tension because, as always, in any military conflict, there's lives on the line, right?
Yeah.
So I feel like that is a time where I was able to listen to what they were saying and be able to disagree with them and not to
Hmm.
go after them, right? But what they said, right?
Yeah.
So, hey, I wasn't saying, hey, First Sergeant, you're dumb. We're not doing that. I said, hey, First Sergeant, I like this, I like that, but I don't like that part of it. So we're not going to, I went after the objective portion of it, not the personal side of it. So I think that
Right.
was a good time where I was able to kind of understand the emotional impacts of words and actions right then, so that, to make something more productive. Now, I'll share with you another time that I failed completely when it comes to emotional intelligence and conflict. Um, a few years later, I was teaching cadets. I was evaluating a sticks lane of, so that's a situational tactical exercise that one of the cadets was leading. So this one college junior it's their big test, right? So in summer between their junior and senior year, all the ROTC cadets in college go to this training in the month, and they have to, for a month in the summer, and they have to pass these lanes, right, to be continue on in the program and to be promoted to a second lieutenant, commissioned as an officer in the United States Army. So this one six lane, this one cadet, like I was in charge, and to me, I was asking him where we were on the map. And to me, it was very easy. There's a hill right in front of us. There's a big old hill right in front of us. And to our left is a river. You could see it from the hill that we were sort of on. So to me, it was very easy. I pull up my
Yeah.
compass. I can tell where the mountain is. I can tell where the water is. I should be able to find that point on the map, knowing generally where we have traveled.
Yeah.
So to me, it was very easy. And at the time, it was my expectation that a cadet that is a junior that is going through this camp, this is pass or fail.
Mhm.
If you don't pass this camp, then you're not going to be commissioned.
Yeah.
I felt like I expected him to be much better than he was.
Right.
And so I said, hey, cadet, where are you? Show me on the map where you are. And he couldn't do it.
Mm.
So I immediately, like, the hackles on my neck stood up and I felt my face getting all hot. And I was like, what do you mean you don't know where you are? It's like, I could see it. And looking back, I can see it so clearly. Like he just had this like scared look on his face, right? Because I was a senior captain, right? With a combat
Yeah.
patch on my shoulder, a ranger tab, a combat action badge,
Yeah.
like what we call scare badges in the army that
Yeah.
would tell a person, oh my God, this person's done some things.
Yeah.
Uh, and so I could just see it on his face, just like blood drained from his face, right? He went pale
Yeah.
and his eyes got wide open. I said, what do you mean you don't know where you are? I started getting all hot, right? Like, there's a mountain right there. Where are you? I don't know, sir. There's a river right there. Where are you? Where's your compass?
Mm.
Like I
Yeah.
can remember it. And like, luckily, one of the guys I was working with, another fellow captain, he kind of grabbed me by the shoulders. I got this. You go center yourself. And he started talking him through it. And looking back on it, I totally messed that up. Right. Like I had expectations of what I thought this cadet should know. And I knew what I knew as a captain,
Yeah.
but that's not necessarily what that cadet would have known. And
Yeah.
I feel like I messed up that situation so bad, that conflict so bad emotionally. because I lost him. Right, he didn't learn anything from that engagement other than to be scared of Captain.
Yeah. It, it is it is a challenge sometimes, I think, as leaders, because when we are used to operating in an organization with high standards,
Mm,
and then maybe we have someone who is not our rock star performer, and we're trying to train them up and trying to get them there. And maybe it's just a new entry level type position that somebody's coming
mm,
in on. And, if you ask me, um, when I'm not standing there in that moment, I would be like, "Oh yeah, absolutely. I want to help this person. I'm going to train them up and everything." But we have to realize, as leaders, we are subject to human emotions. And what
yes.
happens to us sometimes is we walk in, maybe I walk out on the production floor and I think everything's great. But then I see, Craig's over there just messing it up. Like he is just not doing good. And it is real easy for us as leaders, if we're not mindful, and if it's even compounded by, maybe I just walked out of a bad meeting, we got all bad
Mm,
results for this quarter, so I'm already upset. And then I
yeah.
walk out and I'm like, well, no wonder we're not making our numbers. Look at Craig over here. Look at what he's doing. And so it's real easy for me to like almost create conflict.
Yeah.
Um, and if we don't have that good emotional intelligence to be able to rein ourselves back in and also read the situation, and maybe this individual is in this like terrified moment. Maybe they know they messed up and
Mm,
they are not listening, because it doesn't matter what I tell somebody. If they're not listening, I can't help them get better. And so to be able to say, okay, we're going to face this conflict here, but we're going to step away for a minute, and then we're going to reconvene when both of us are at the ability to objectively look at things.
yeah. Yeah. That's so. Like, if there's two welders that just don't get along for whatever reason,
Yeah.
right? And
Right.
they just don't get along. Okay, well, we have to understand that emotionally, right?
Yeah.
Maybe we ask some questions to why they don't like each other. Probably not in front of each other,
Right.
but we still have to then solve that problem, right? Without bringing our own baggage into it,
Yeah.
right? So now there's this conflict between these two welders that we got to solve, Craig. How do we
Yeah.
solve these two welders?
And so that brings us into, what's some tactics that we can
Yeah,
use for, successfully resolving these conflicts. And you kind of alluded to it there. One thing I like to do initially is, anybody who's worked with me before knows I'm big on asking questions. And so if I know Craig's over there and he's just can't get along with anybody that works next to him, or maybe it's just one person, maybe it's Craig and Andrew over there, they can't get along. Well, I want to speak to each of them individually. And one of the first things I want to do is I want to ask them, hey, what's going on?
yeah,
And I'm going to be as vague and general with my questions at the open as I can. And the reason is, it may not actually be that Craig doesn't like that other welder. It may actually be he's got something going on at home. Maybe he had a bad morning. Maybe something was going on with his truck this morning. Whatever the case is, I want to try to figure that stuff out. Um, because the root cause, I think of it like root cause analysis. What's the root
mm-hmm.
cause of this
Yeah,
conflict?
yeah,
It may not be these personalities. That may be a symptom. And so, um, that's one of the first things I look at. And then I like to tie it back to the standards. Earlier you mentioned about how, when you were looking at evaluating those plans and which ones you're going to use, you didn't make it about what Craig recommended.
yeah,
You made it about, does this technique meet our standard? And if,
yeah.
you come in there and the standard is to build 10 tables a day and Craig's over there building 8 a day, you don't have to make it about Craig. You make it about, hey, why are you only able to produce 8 tables a day?
Mm-hmm.
The person next to you is creating 11. Do you not have the tools necessary?
Yeah,
And it can be very, and I know that sounds oversimplified to our listeners maybe, but the reality is if I go down there and just make accusations, I may look real silly when he turns around and tells me, Well, I'm using a hand screwdriver and he's got a drill. And
Yeah,
he's got power
exactly.
tools. I got hand tools. Oh, wow. That drastically changes things.
Yeah, it's a lot.
Yeah. And so we have to be very careful as leaders when we start wading off into this conflict resolution thing. And that's why I like to ask questions, because I want to get as much objective information. And I don't care about opinions. I don't want to hear somebody say, oh, well, I think this or I feel. No, we ain't worried about that yet. What I really want is objective statements. Do you have the tools you need? Do you have the materials you need? I want to ask things that we can get back to the standard. Because if the standard is that you have, X amount of materials at your workstation and somebody else is not providing you that, well, then, the problem's not here. Um, but if we're not careful as leaders and we go into these things assuming we know stuff, we can take a conflict and make it 10 times worse, in my opinion.
Mhm. Yeah. What if you'd gone down there, the guy making hand tools, and say, "Hey, you have to stay late. You have to, and you're not getting overtime
Right.
because you didn't meet standard, or you're fired for not meeting standards."
Yeah.
Well, he's like, "That's
Oh, yeah.
ridiculous.
Yeah.
I've got
And
hand tools."
if you think you had a conflict beforehand, you're about to have a major conflict now,
Yeah.
uh, that
Yeah.
you've really intensified. And so that's one of the things, and it goes back to that communication piece. We answer these questions, we communicate, we figure out why we're not meeting the standard. And, you always hear people talk about separating the problem from the people.
Mhm.
And you don't ever want it to be personal. Um, and sometimes it's tough because there are personalities that sometimes don't get along, but we have to still, address things objectively to the standards. And, and it comes into, did you meet the standard? And if not, we're holding you accountable. It's
Mhm.
not because you're my favorite or I don't like you. It has nothing to do with the personality. It is more to do with that objective behavior that we can address. One other thing that I like to consider sometimes is viewing the conflict resolution as a negotiation.
Mhm.
Sometimes when we change that terminology and we talk about it as a negotiation, I think it puts a little different connotation in our head, and it's a little easier to try to go about it in a deliberate manner, but also trying to resolve it so that both parties are pleased with the results. A
Mhm.
lot of times when you're going into negotiation, and there's multiple ways to do that, but I like to always think about how do we make this the proverbial win-win scenario
Yeah.
to where both sides are um, happy. Now, did they get 100% of what they wanted? Probably not. But if both parties walk away with 85-90%, they're usually pretty happy.
Yeah.
And I think there's a lot of ways we can do this. And when I say negotiations, I don't like to think of it as splitting up the pie, because if we do
Mhm.
that,
Mhm.
everything that I gain, you lose. So
Yeah.
instead, I like to look at what is important to each party and what are they really, not just their positions, but what are their interests. Because maybe rather than half of the pie, maybe I don't like pie, maybe I want cake. And so, but if I don't ask those questions and I just assume that you're trying to take half of my pie, we've got this conflict here, we're upset with each other, and it's all for nothing. And the reality is if a leader goes in there and asks good questions, we may find out that one wants the pie and one wants the cake, and everybody can be happy.
Yeah.
And
Turns
so
out there is no conflict.
right. And I think that just looking at it from a different perspective and considering it as a negotiation, to me, um, sometimes can shed the light on it for leaders, because sometimes we don't think of it that way. We think it's this, you know, me versus you type attitude,
Yeah. Win or
and it
lose.
doesn't have to be.
Yeah. Yeah. You have to go in there with the idea that, okay, we have to produce this, or we have to, this is the expected outcome, right? So
Hmm.
how do we all get to that expected outcome in the best way,
Right.
right? That's the whole point. And so
Yeah.
you could say negotiation, you could say collaboration,
Yep.
um, compromise to some degree, right? Is
Yeah.
similar. You don't have to attach the baggage of conflict resolution
Right.
to it,
Yeah.
right?
Because it goes back to that communication and that, perception's reality. If any time one of my leaders had historically mentioned conflict resolution, if I had a bad experience with that, then it may already have caused me to start having these negative thoughts, as opposed to if I've got a leader that just comes in asking questions and is just trying to proactively figure out what's going on
Mm-hmm.
and help negotiate through that. And I think collaboration's a big part of it, because if we think about it, we're trying to I like the idea of a team of teams.
Yeah.
Jim McChrystal in his book talks about that, and I think it's important for organizations to have that mentality. So even though maybe sales and operations has a little friction there, um, those are two separate teams, but those teams are on the same team, and we are ultimately trying to work together because we want our business and our organization to be successful. So hopefully some of these tactics for conflict resolution will help you all out. And maybe you can, next time you've got a conflict brewing and you're deciding, do I go talk with this guy or do I try to avoid it? Think back to the buffaloes and the cows, and hopefully this
Mm-hmm.
will be something that you can take away and use in your leadership journey.
As always, take these lessons, use them, and spread them. Everyone is welcome in the cohort.
Be sure to like, follow, and subscribe for more, and drop us a line at commandpostcohort.com to request a specific topic.
We'll see you next time on the cohort.